And thanks for staying with us on Morning Live. Now, media sources in Nairobi have reported that Kenyans are enraged by the government's decision to secure a $2.34 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. Now, by Tuesday, over 200,000 Kenyan citizens are said to have signed an online petition demanding a cancellation of the IMF loan. Kenyans are raising concerns of a government debt associated with the IMF loans, which get to be passed on to citizens in all sorts of taxes. And one of the country's publications, the Business Daily, reported that the international lender has now advised Kenya's Treasury to impose a 16% value-added tax on fuel, doubling the current 8%. Dr. David Ndii is a Kenyan-based economist, managing director of Africa Economics, and also former World Bank economist. And he's here to give us a perspective of what is currently unfolding in Kenya. Dr. Ndii, thank you so much. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much.
So let's just start by looking at the briefing that was done to the media in Nairobi on Tuesday. You briefed the media, giving them your views there. You were also part of a conversation and robust exchanges taking place on social media, as we've been following. So give us a sense of why exactly Kenyans are angry about this current financial assistance from the IMF.
I think there are several reasons, one of which you already mentioned, that in the last couple of weeks, fuel prices have gone up because of an increase in taxes. That has already happened. Kenyans were complaining about it. So when the IMF loan was announced, it then they became aware that this was part of the conditions of the loan. The other reason is that, of course, we have had Corona the whole year. The government has not very good in assisting Kenyans, but Kenyans have learned that the government has raised huge amount of money internationally for Corona virus sort of economic and health support. And just a couple of weeks ago, I think 2 weeks now, the government imposed another lockdown, particularly on the sort of Nairobi metropolitan area, which of course has affected people's economic life quite severely. Of course, Kenya has been going into an economic crisis for a long time, even before Corona virus crisis. And therefore, it's a culmination of all these things that Kenyan realized that the government, although that has been happening, I think, again, it took the IMF loan, and Kenyans realizing that the government is back into the traditional IMF programs. Many of the young people don't know about structural adjustment programs. They just hearing about them. But it took them that to realize just how severe the sort of fiscal crisis and economic crisis the country is in.
Dr. Ndii, as someone who has worked at the World Bank, you've been exposed to the workings of the Bretton Woods institutions. There are, of course, those who hold a view that these loan facilities from the IMF, from the World Bank, have actually assisted poor countries. But there is, of course, the other view that they actually economically cripple emerging economies. So give us a sense, having sat on both sides of this divide, of what is actually the true state of play when it comes to countries taking out these loan facilities from Bretton Woods institutions.
Let me start by saying that things have changed a lot over time. And even in Africa, you now have two types of countries in terms of international sort of development finance. You have countries which are still heavily dependent on ODA, official aid, financing, ODA, including from the IFIs. And you have now countries like Kenya, which are now being called frontier markets, which have gone are increasingly reliant on borrowing from bond markets in Europe. And of course, there has been recently an entry of China, so they've borrowed heavily from China. Now, how these two different types of countries relate to the IMF and the World Bank is very different. Kenya is one of these new frontier market countries, and in fact, one of the big ones. So the reason why these countries have gone into the markets is, in fact, to diversify their sources of finance, not to be dependent on ODA. But what has happened is that these countries have overborrowed because now they have access to capital markets, and Kenya is a very good example of that. It's like somebody who has never had a credit card, and they just get their first credit card and they become quite irresponsible with it. So they are finding themselves going back to these IFIs, to the World Bank and IMF, to get what you might call credit enhancement. And this is the case with Kenya. Kenya needs to go back and borrow huge amounts of money from the bond markets. But it is already classified by the IMF as in high risk of debt default, high risk of debt distress. So it's might not be able to borrow, or might have been borrowed at very high rates. Some countries like Zambia have probably priced themselves out of the market. So the IMF loan is really not so much the finance that the Kenya is relying on, but it's in fact relying on the IMF endorsement so as to reduce the risk of borrowing from the markets. So this is a relatively new development. It only dates back to about a decade. And therefore, you cannot really talk about that relationship the same way as the countries which are heavily dependent on ODA. The countries that are now in trouble, in serious trouble and debt distress are countries like Kenya and probably Angola as well, a few other of the more sort of higher income, middle income countries. And they are now caught between the IMF and the World Bank, China and the markets. You really cannot direct your rubber at just one source.
And as you say, at times you need to borrow more and more just to keep your head above water. What do you make of the South African situation, Dr. Ndii, given that you spoke about Kenya and you've spoken out quite strongly about Kenya taking that IMF loan, but South Africa was in the same predicament last year when our finance minister announced that government intended to borrow from the IMF. There were a few murmurs, but ultimately we did take that loan. So what should governments do when they find themselves in situations of financial crises, such as those that have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, for example? What would be the best option in cases such as these?
The IMF exists primarily for that purpose. It exists to tide countries over external economic shocks. So the IMF facilities are also not the same. Because countries are members of the IMF, when a country experiences an economic shock, there is an entitlement that it can draw on from the IMF. It's almost like an overdraft arrangement with your banker. And you have an overdraft facility which you draw on in the event that you have a cash crunch. And I suspect that's the kind of loan that South Africa has taken. And even Kenya has taken, sort of one of those, a couple of, in the last sort of 2 decades or so. But when you have what you call chronic balance of payments conditions. May I start back and say, those sort of emergency facilities do not have any conditions. It's an entitlement. Yeah, if certain shocks happen, you draw on that facility. It's a sort of standing arrangement. But when you have chronic problems, which go on over time and are now sort of of a structural nature. That is when now these countries, and this is only available to low-income countries, and sort of I don't think I'm not sure South Africa is eligible for that. What we call extended or enhanced structural adjustment facilities. They've got all manner of names. They used to be called poverty and growth reduction facility. Those are now the structural adjustment loans, which come with lots of conditions because you now have chronic. Your problems have become chronic. They are of a structural nature. And basically, the IMF it usually comes in almost like a prefect of the other lenders. Yeah, the World Bank will usually be the big lender, and some of the sort of sometimes countries which are grant recipients. So countries' relationships with the IMF is very different depending on what they are and also what kind of facility you have taken. So in the case of South Africa, if you're talking about, because South Africa has very deep financial markets of its own, and also I think South Africa is able to borrow from the bond markets, I think even up to this point, without any sort of fear of not being able to raise enough money or very, very high rates. So it varies what sort of facility that a country is taking, and you need to look at it. But in the case of Kenya, this is certainly gotten to the point where it has now taken one of those traditional structural adjustment programs, a 3-year program with conditions to be reviewed every 6 months. That really, it's really under IMF economic supervision.
But you look at what the citizens say, and looking at that online petition and what the Kenyan citizens are balking at. We look at South Africa, and in April we saw South Africans hit with increases that include fuel price hikes, electricity increases, tariff increases, and then you have the knock-on effect of food price inflation. And all of this happens in a context of an ailing economy, of job losses and retrenchments. How does the working class, how do the unemployed people in these economies, Dr. Ndii, fend for themselves? Because it is ultimately they who buckle under these economic pressures.
I believe South Africa has been in this crisis for longer than the sort of recent developments around Corona. The problems, particularly with your sort of infrastructure utilities. What's the power company called?
Eskom.
I know. Yeah.
Our power utility.
Yes.
Eskom.
Yes, your power utility.
Eskom.
I know it's caused huge fiscal problems. You've got problems with the South African Airways also getting subsidies. I think you've got problems with just the airline, the power company. You've got a state capture inquiry that's still going. I think there's no denying that South Africa has a fair amount of structural economic problems that it needs to deal with. So I don't really, it's not yet, obviously it can get quite bad. It can get as bad as Argentina, but I don't think South Africa is anywhere near that yet. But I do not believe that a country like South Africa, and Kenya for that matter, where Kenya has now reached, these are countries whose problems that the IMF and the World Bank can solve. These are structural problems that the countries themselves have to resolve, and they are difficult problems that the countries have to. I think for South Africa, the fundamental problem is that it has really not been able to find new sources of productivity growth and economic expansion, which can create jobs and expand the economic base to cover the entire population. Because obviously during apartheid, the economy was structured only to support a minority. And since South Africa now became a majoritarian society, it's actually not been able to find sort of a model for a much more inclusive sort of productivity, sort of job creating economy. And we also have a similar problem because we are also historically a settler colony. So these are deep sort of structural problems that are not going to be resolved by finance of any type.
And as we wrap this conversation, Dr. Ndii, interestingly, in addition to the worry about government debt, Kenyan citizens have also expressed their outrage and complained about corruption. And we have a similar problem once again in South Africa. So let's talk about that relationship, this corruption that has basically just taken root of our economies and our countries as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I noticed that your president is one of the big beneficiaries of the Black economic empowerment. And our president is the second generation of the main beneficiary of our Black economic empowerment, which was called Africanization. So there is a parallel there of an African sort of political class which straddles both the politics, the elite, which straddles politics and business. And that's a very, very severe problem. Yeah, because that class, its interest is highly conflicted. It is actually unable to change the economy because they are beneficiaries of the status quo. And corruption becomes sort of a very difficult thing. It's actually, I think that we are now using the right word, state capture, as for this character of corruption. It still doesn't capture it completely. This type of corruption where you have an elite which straddles both politics and business, and therefore it cannot bite the bullet to transform the economy because it's the beneficiary of the status quo. And also the fact that then if you are sort of on both sides, you are very much exposed, and it's very difficult to actually fight corruption. Corruption becomes systemic to defeat. The two of them, of course, related in more than one way. They are related in that a lot of the money that has been borrowed in the case of Kenya has actually been stolen. So part of the reason why you're not able to service the debt is because you have stolen the money. They are also related in the fact that the reason why you went to borrow in the first place, much of it was driven by private interests to finance projects or to finance things that have more private than public benefit. So both the economic and the financial problems that debt causes are related to this conflict of interest between of the country's leadership.
Dr. Ndii, on that very interesting yet somber note, we'll have to leave it, and hopefully we'll engage again in future. But thank you so much for your time this morning. Dr. David Ndii is a Kenyan-based economist and Managing Director of Africa Economics and a former World Bank economist. And we were talking about the current situation on the ground in Kenya as citizens voice their anger against the IMF loan, which has allegedly led to tax increases. And online petition now standing at just over 200,000 signatories by yesterday. So we'll keep our eye on that one to find out what next.